Good morning and welcome to our Facebook Live, or if you're catching this later, good morning. My name is Ailsa Kepi and I'm curator of the group on Facebook, Women Healing from Emotional Abuse with Power, Passion and Pleasure. And you can find out more about me and all of my work with all genders and couples around intimacy and relationships on my website, pleasureforhealth.com. So today I wanted to just kind of hash out and enlarge an idea that typically, and I am going to genderize this a little bit. So if you don't resonate with this particular breakdown as a woman or a man or a non-gendered person, just make it fit what you feel about yourself. But I wanted to break down the difference between leading with vulnerability or leading with, kind of an armoring. And I wanted to do that specifically in relation to how we create intimacy, how we create relationships, because it has a lot to do with, moving forward and whether we end up, inviting almost particular other types of people to be in relationship with, whether we get attacked, whether we become victimized in relationships. I notice, having led women's circles for many years and having worked with men as well, and again, I'm genderizing this, but it could relate to anyone who relates to gender in their own way. If you women tend to lead with a vulnerability, or I should say, people that feel disempowered, or if you have sized up the other person as being stronger than you, or you don't feel you can meet them on an equal level in a challenging kind of dual way, you might come forward with a vulnerability as a strategy for not getting injured or not getting hurt, right? So imagine, a group of, animals, dogs or monkeys or something like that. If you felt inferior, or if you felt like you weren't as strong as the other animal that you were meeting up with, you might lead with, rolling over on your back and showing your vulnerable belly side, because you would try to enlist empathy so that other animal wouldn't hurt you. So I think this is where our idea of leading with vulnerability comes from. And often as women, we are the weaker, we sense ourselves as being weaker. So we tend to lead with rolling over and showing our vulnerability in an effort to elicit a compassionate or an empathetic response so that we don't get hurt. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, you might also have, a person that tends to think of themselves as stronger, will lead with like their strong kind of armoring, and that, or if you're weak and you tend to armor yourself and lead with, this is my shell, you're not getting in, you're not gonna even let intimacy in. And so what happens often, what I see happens in narcissist empath kind of relationships is that the empath is understanding, or being empathic towards other people, and in doing that, they also feel vulnerable. So they're like, well, I'm going to show my vulnerability and try to elicit empathy from the other person. Now that is possibly works if the other person is capable of being empathic and is interested in being vulnerable with you in the same way. What often happens though with narcissistic type of people is that they're not really interested in being vulnerable with you, because they are actually really afraid of being vulnerable, and that's not what they lead with. They want to lead with their empowerment, their strength, their armor, and they are happy just having people on the outside admiring them. And maybe deep down there's a desire for intimacy. I think we all have a desire for connection on some level, potentially, but we can't assume that is the motivating factor for the other person. So oftentimes I end up working with women that have been through emotionally abusive relationships, and they are looking for that connection. They're looking to say, here's my vulnerability, show me your vulnerability. Now we're bonded in knowing each other's vulnerable sides, our softer sides. And now you won't hurt me and I won't hurt you because we understand we both have weaknesses. And that mentality works if you are working with two people that have a similar standpoint on that. But if we roll over and show our vulnerability and the other person says, great, now I'm going to attack you, that doesn't work, right? And that is often what happens in these types of relationships, is it actually, it sometimes enrages the narcissistic abuser type of personality, because now they see you being vulnerable and they're like, well, I can't do that because I don't know how to be vulnerable. Now I'm angry at you for being vulnerable, and I'm going to take that anger out on you by attacking you and hurting you because I don't have the capability. I have to armor. I have to do this because that's the only way I know how to survive. So, and I get that this is only one way of looking at a very complex dynamic, but it's interesting to notice. So my partner, who is a man, and I were talking about leading, men's and women's circles and how to get people to go deeper and connect on a level without eliciting that who's stronger, attack and defend kind of place. So to make a safe place to share and go deeper. For women, often, women come into some of these circles like sharing too much, sharing really deep, vulnerable parts of their lives, and almost as if a challenge, you can almost feel it. It's like a challenge to the other women then to be as vulnerable, right? And it kind of has this feeling of like, you kind of feel like, do I want to engage in this kind of, it's almost like a violent sharing. And I know that's a strong word, but we have this kind of like drawing back, like, whoa, this person's like oversharing, and women will have that sometimes. And why is that? Why do we tend to overshare? Well, I feel like there's this real deep desire to connect, but if we overshare, it's almost like putting a challenge out there to the other women in the group or something to also overshare, because now I've shared a lot, now you have to share a lot, and it's this challenging thing. And still we have this kind of conflict relationship. So a lot of what I'm working with women through my programs is to actually, what is the right amount of sharing? How do we feel into, showing the right amount of vulnerability without oversharing? How do we keep the right amount of armoring without walling ourselves in? This is a nuanced thing that ideally we learn as we're children, kind of growing up in a relational setting. Unfortunately, most of us don't have families and teachers and societies that even understand how this all works. And many people are always conflictual in their relationships rather than nurturing and holding. So many of us grow up, going to see therapists later on in life because we're trying to get that like safe place to actually learn about ourselves. So, hopefully, I don't know, if COVID did anything, it kind of pointed out how this is actually even more obvious. We don't know how to relate. We actually don't. We aren't very good at it. And so noticing some of these dynamics can help, and noticing the urge in yourself can help. So if you have an urge to if you notice that you don't know someone very well and you're sharing really deep, dark secrets, it's interesting to ask yourself, why am I doing that? Like, what is my motivation with sharing my life story with this person in the grocery store or something? And is it to elicit an empathy, a connection? Because now I want them to share something, and then we're bonded. Now we're bonded with these kinds of wounds. And this happens often in, Addicts Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. Like, people get together and it's like, I'm an addict, you're an addict. Now we both are vulnerable to that same degree. And there's nothing wrong with support groups to a certain extent, but we want to move beyond identifying with that as the only way to connect. And I think that's what's important as well, is that it does create connection. If I'm vulnerable and you're vulnerable, and now we have this like agreed upon vulnerability, we know something about each other, there is a connection there. But is that real intimacy? Is that really sharing the breadth and the full spectrum of who we are as human beings? Well, no, not really. And if we always require a sharing of, weaknesses with someone in order to feel close to them, we tend to polarize our relationships. So I tended to do this as a woman. I would share, a vulnerability. I learned this from my mother, I think, and my father was British. And so, he kind of had the armoring. And so I learned this dynamic, and I would overshare, and then I would want my partner to share. And, if he did share, then he was kind of rewarded. And if he didn't share, it kind of polarized us. And I would say that, my part in the breakdown of my marriage, other than he was definitely unable to change and work through some of his issues, was this polarizing. I wanted more and more sharing, and he became more and more withdrawn or armored because he's like, whoa, this is like, I can't go to that depth in myself. I'm going to break down. And so he would kind of armor more and more, and I would chase after, and he would armor. And so, there's no intimacy there. So it is definitely something that we want to think about. So, how do we notice this in ourselves? Well, I would sort of recommend that the idea of when you get into bed at night, instead of just watching Netflix until you fall asleep or something like that, take a few moments to think through the day. Think through your interactions with people. Hopefully you had at least a couple of interactions, even if it was online, with work colleagues, with your kids. Notice if you lead with, a vulnerable share about yourself. Like, oh, I didn't sleep well last night and I'm feeling really, iffy today. Is that the first thing you say to your work colleagues, and why? Ask yourself really honestly, why did you share that? Was that to elicit some kind of like, oh my God, yeah, like I didn't sleep well. Wasn't that an awful full moon? Now both of us didn't feel well. Let's like go get a second coffee, and you take up an extra half an hour of your work morning kind of resonating with each other about the fact that neither of you slept well. And you get that connection. And sure, that can feel good in a way, but is it really empowering in the end of the day? Neither of you has actually taken on the fact that you might take a deep breath and moved forward and felt good about it. You're like, oh, I can feel better about feeling tired and not doing much today because the other person is tired and not doing much today. And now I'm not the only one. So we're all going to be tired and not do much today. And, that's keeping us all at this kind of lower level of energetics, if you will. So, we don't want to be, you might also have a narcissistic person at work that would be like, oh, well, you should just get over it. And maybe you need to stay an extra hour, if you're napping this morning kind of thing. And they might attack you for that. And that, that is something that a dynamic that happens at work too. And that's not what we want either, but we want to actually empower each other to say, hey, I hear you didn't sleep well. I know what that feels like. I can feel for you. And what can we do to help us be productive with today? Like, what's the best way forward here? I mean, do we need to do some breath work? Do we need to go outside for 5 minutes and get some fresh air? Do we need to make sure we're doing something either really routine that you don't have to think about too much today or whatever? Like, help each other actually get something done at work. So that's just something to think about. So at the end of the day, take a few minutes and write down, what kind of interactions you had throughout the day with your spouse, with your kids, with your partners, with your work colleagues, friends, and see how you tend to interact. And if that's something that you're interested in working on more and learning to kind of adapt the level of sharing to the relationship that you have with that person, i.e., keep your vulnerable, really deep sharing for the right relationships, right? For the ones that are built and have a safe container for that kind of sharing and that aren't going to let you spill out into your work and into your life and onto your kids. This is a big one. Like, are you going to let this affect your kids? Are you going to overshare with them? And then they go to school feeling like the heaviness of your emotional sharing. We want to actually know how to regulate our own sharing and how we connect with people and create more options, more choice around, I'm going to share, I'm going to be able to share in many different levels. And I know how to make small talk with these people, and I know how to go deep with these people, and I know when to share and when not to share. Like, these are relational skills that we can learn. If you're interested in any of that, check out my free webinar. You can look on ailsakepi.com, check out the free webinar, book a call with me. I would love to, hear about your choice. And actually, on the call, that's no charge for this call. If you are feeling ready to talk about this, we can get you some real clarity on your specific situation. And, maybe at the end of the call, we'll discuss whether we might be a good fit to work together or not. But you will get really great benefit just from talking this through and coming up with some, 2 or 3 action steps for you in building your relational skills. That won't cost you anything except your time, your commitment, and your dedication to your own self-growth. That's what I ask of you if you want to move forward with this. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and it makes you think a little bit about how you tend to lead in your interactions with people. And I hope to maybe get a chance to talk to you at some point in person. ailsakepi.com or my coaching website, pleasureforhealth.com. And I will talk to you all very soon.